Sarah Montgomery stood tall in the crowded courtroom, her posture composed but her mind racing with thoughts of what this moment could mean. She had grown used to the judgments passed on her, both in the court of public opinion and in the legal realm. Today, however, felt different. The air felt heavier, as though the walls were closing in on her with every word spoken. Judge William Harper, with his white robe and his reputation for being both stern and fair, peered down at her with an expression that gave nothing away. It wasn't the first time Sarah had found herself in the courtroom, though this time it was different. This time, she was not being called to defend her environmental initiatives in the face of political pushback. This time, she was on the receiving end of the system's cold gaze. Sarah Montgomery. Judge Harper's voice echoed through the room, cutting through the hushed murmurs of the audience. You stand before this court today due to an incident involving your organization, Green Horizons. The charge is one of environmental negligence, where improperly managed waste was disposed of at one of your organization's community initiatives. Do you have any comments before sentencing? Sarah's heart raced, but her face remained unreadable. She had seen this type of scenario before, the misunderstandings that often occurred when passionate people were misunderstood, their work misrepresented. The community event had been a success, at least in the eyes of those it helped. But to the untrained eye, one misplaced pile of waste could easily be spun as a failure. I believe the charge misrepresents the situation, Sarah said calmly, her voice steady. The waste was left behind unintentionally during a cleanup effort. My team has already begun rectifying the situation. I assure you, Your Honor, that Green Horizons has always adhered to the highest standards in sustainability and environmental responsibility. Her words carried the weight of years of tireless work, working against systemic injustice, creating programs that empowered local communities, and pushing for policies that prioritized the Earth's health as much as human prosperity. But to Judge Harper, who had never personally seen the impact of her work, the explanation may have seemed like just another defense from a community organizer trying to avoid accountability. The judge didn't immediately respond. His fingers tapped slowly on the gavel, the rhythmic sound echoing in the silence. It felt as though every second stretched into infinity. After a long pause, Judge Harper spoke, his voice steady but firm. Regardless of the good intentions behind your organization's efforts, the facts of the case cannot be ignored. The court hereby fines you the amount of $10,000 for this violation. This is a reminder that environmental stewardship must be practiced responsibly at all levels. Sarah didn't flinch. Her expression remained unchanged. She had expected this. The fine wasn't the problem. It was the misconception that would follow her in the eyes of the public. The idea that her work was unorganized, irresponsible. The misunderstanding that, if left unaddressed, could undermine everything she had spent years fighting for. As she stood there, accepting the judgment, her mind began to form a new resolve. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. And she would make sure that the world knew the real story. The fine was paid, but the consequences lingered long after the courtroom doors closed behind Sarah. She stepped out into the sunlight, her face calm, yet her heart heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. The legal battle was one thing, but it was the broader implications of the ruling that troubled her. Sarah knew that the media would latch onto the narrative of her fine, and once the story was out, it would be difficult to shift the public's perception. As expected, the headlines the next morning focused on the fine. Environmental group fined for negligence. The bold print read, accompanied by a photograph of Sarah standing outside the courthouse. In the image, her expression was composed, but the title alone felt like an accusation. The public didn't see the countless hours Sarah and her team had spent setting up clean energy programs in remote villages, or the partnerships she cultivated with environmental leaders across the globe. No, they only saw a simple headline and a small incident that seemed to reinforce old stereotypes about community organizations. Sarah's phone rang off the hook for days, but it wasn't the kind of attention she had hoped for. Journalists and commentators called, all eager to sensationalize the case. A few supportive messages trickled in from her colleagues, but the noise from critics was louder. Some claimed she wasn't taking responsibility for the situation, while others suggested her nonprofit was poorly managed. The worst of it came from those who saw the fine as proof of her incompetence, a label Sarah had fought so hard to avoid her entire life. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Lisa, one of her closest allies. "I know things are tough right now, but don't let them win. We know who you are and what you're doing. Don't let the noise drown you out." The words were a comfort, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of frustration. How had things gotten so distorted? It wasn't just about the fine anymore. It was about the perception of her entire mission. She had spent years fighting for environmental justice, pushing to create sustainable solutions for communities ravaged by climate change and industrial pollution. Now all of that was being overshadowed by a minor mishap at one of her events. But Sarah wasn't one to back down from a challenge. She refused to let the public's perception of her organization define its purpose. There was too much at stake. Green Horizons had never been about public recognition or praise. It was about making tangible changes in the world that could leave a lasting impact. Determined to steer the conversation back to what truly mattered, Sarah began drafting a letter to the public. She would explain not only the incident but the broader scope of the work Green Horizons was doing. She would make sure that her voice and the mission of her organization was not drowned out by a single negative headline. While her critics had their say, Sarah's resolve grew stronger. This would not be the story they told. She would set the record straight, and in doing so, show the world the true power of perseverance in the fight for environmental justice. Judge William Harper sat at his desk late that evening, the weight of the day's decision pressing heavily on his mind. His fingers absently flipped through the case files, but his thoughts were elsewhere, on Sarah Montgomery, the environmental activist who had stood before him just hours earlier. He had seen many defendants in his courtroom over the years, each with their own story, but something about her had stayed with him. Her calm demeanor, her unwavering commitment to her cause, and the quiet confidence in her words all struck him deeply. He had made his decision swiftly, confident that the law was clear and that the fine was appropriate. But now, in the solitude of his office, doubts began to creep in. Judge Harper prided himself on being a fair and impartial judge, but what if he had missed something? What if his ruling had overlooked the bigger picture? His mind replayed the trial, scrutinizing every moment. He remembered Sarah's explanation of the waste disposal incident, how she had explained it as an unintentional oversight during a community event. But he had barely given her words a chance to sink in before issuing the fine. He pulled up Green Horizons' website on his computer. What he found surprised him. Sarah's organization had a long history of advocating for environmental justice, focusing on issues of sustainability and equity. Their work spanned the globe, from providing clean drinking water to underserved communities in Africa to lobbying for stronger environmental regulations at the United Nations. Green Horizons wasn't some small, underfunded charity. It was a well-established organization with a clear and ambitious mission. The more he read, the more Judge Harper realized how little he truly knew about the woman who had stood before him in court. His eyes lingered on the stories of Green Horizons' efforts to address the disproportionate impact of climate change on marginalized communities, efforts that Sarah had led with grace and passion. He had been so quick to judge her based on a single, isolated incident, without fully understanding the scope of her work. How could he have missed it? How could he have been so blind? As the evening stretched into night, Judge Harper found himself grappling with a new understanding of Sarah's mission. She wasn't just another activist. She was a tireless champion for the voiceless, someone who had dedicated her life to making the world a better place. The fine he had imposed, though perhaps legally justified, felt out of place in the larger context of her work. Determined to make things right, Judge Harper sat down at his desk and began drafting a letter. He wasn't sure exactly where this journey would lead, but he knew one thing for certain. He needed to reach out to Sarah. He needed to apologize, and more importantly, he needed to learn from her. to understand the depth of her commitment and the challenges she faced in her fight for environmental justice. In that moment, Judge Harper realized that the law wasn't just about rules and fines. It was about understanding, about seeing the bigger picture, and about doing what was right, not just what was easy. The next morning, Judge Harper couldn't shake the feeling that his understanding of the case, and Sarah Montgomery, was incomplete. He felt an urgency to rectify his oversight. As he sat at his desk, reviewing case files and legal precedents, his mind kept returning to Green Horizons and the woman who had become the face of that movement. Sarah's calm in the courtroom had been a stark contrast to the urgency of her cause, and that contrast left him unsettled. The more Judge Harper researched, the more he uncovered about Sarah's background, and with every click, his perception shifted. He discovered that Sarah was not only a leader in the environmental movement, but also a fierce advocate for social justice. Growing up in a neighborhood ravaged by pollution and poverty, she had witnessed firsthand the struggles of families who lived in the shadows of factories and waste sites. The air was thick with smog, and the water was tainted with chemicals, but it was the resilience of the people that had sparked Sarah's mission. Her journey had begun as a young woman volunteering with local groups to clean up toxic sites and educate communities about sustainable practices. It had grown into something far more powerful. Green Horizons, the organization she had founded, was now recognized globally for its groundbreaking work on climate change mitigation, environmental education, and advocating for policies that put people and the planet first. The initiatives ranged from developing affordable solar energy systems for impoverished areas to partnering with indigenous leaders to preserve vital ecosystems that were threatened by deforestation and climate change. Judge Harper felt a deep sense of respect for Sarah as he read about the work Green Horizons had done. In addition to providing resources for clean energy and environmental preservation, Sarah's organization had been instrumental in advocating for legislation that promoted equitable access to green technologies in low-income communities around the world. Sarah's work had garnered her recognition from major international environmental bodies and governments, but more importantly, it had changed the lives of thousands of people who had been left behind in the global conversation on sustainability. What struck Judge Harper most was the way Sarah balanced her work in the field with her commitment to social justice. She had always emphasized that environmental protection couldn't be separated from issues of inequality and poverty. She championed policies that ensured the poorest communities, often the most affected by pollution and climate change, were not only protected but empowered. It was clear that her fight for the environment wasn't just about nature, it was about people. As Judge Harper sat back in his chair, he felt a shift within himself. He had always considered himself a man of justice, but now he realized that his understanding of justice needed to evolve. It wasn't enough to enforce the law. He needed to consider the broader context of the lives those laws affected. Sarah's story was a powerful reminder of the importance of empathy and understanding in the pursuit of fairness. He knew what he had to do. He needed to reach out to Sarah and make things right. But more than that, he needed to learn from her. He needed to be part of the solution. A few days after his late-night research, Judge Harper sent a simple but heartfelt email to Sarah Montgomery. His message was brief but sincere. Dear Ms. Montgomery, I want to express my sincerest apologies for the decision I made regarding your case. After learning more about your work and the incredible impact Green Horizons has had globally, I realized that I misjudged both the situation and you. I would like to meet with you in person to offer my apology and hear more about your mission. Please let me know if you would be willing to meet. I truly believe I have a lot to learn from you. Respectfully, Judge William Harper. He sent the email with a mix of nervousness and hope. He had never before felt compelled to reach out to a defendant in this way, but something about Sarah's cause had shifted his perspective. She wasn't just another person fighting a legal battle. She was a leader whose vision extended far beyond the walls of the courtroom. To his relief, Sarah replied almost immediately. Her response was polite, if somewhat cautious. Dear Judge Harper, thank you for your message. I appreciate your willingness to reach out. I believe the conversation is important, and I am open to meeting. However, I ask that we meet on neutral ground. Perhaps a public space would be best, so we can talk without the constraints of the courtroom. Best regards, Sarah Montgomery. Judge Harper agreed to her request, and they arranged to meet at a quiet coffee shop a few days later. He arrived early, unsure of what to expect. Sarah had earned his respect through her work, but he was still unsure how their conversation would unfold. Would she accept his apology? Would she even want to meet with him after the way he had treated her? When Sarah walked in, he immediately recognized her, not just from her photographs, but from the aura of determination she carried. She was dressed casually, but there was a quiet strength in her posture. Sarah had a way of commanding attention without raising her voice. She was a woman on a mission, and that mission was bigger than anything Judge Harper had ever known. They exchanged pleasantries, and Sarah ordered a coffee before sitting down across from him. The conversation began slowly, both of them skirting around the elephant in the room. Judge Harper felt awkward but was determined to make amends. Finally, Sarah spoke, her tone both calm and firm. "I appreciate you reaching out, Judge Harper. To be honest, I wasn't sure how to respond at first. My work has never been about seeking recognition or apologies, but about creating real change. That being said, I'm glad you want to understand more about what I do. I believe we can learn a lot from each other." Harper nodded, feeling the weight of her words. He had heard about Sarah's accomplishments, but hearing it from her directly felt different. Her presence, the calm in her voice, and the conviction in her eyes reminded him why he had reached out. He wasn't just meeting with an activist, he was meeting with a leader. "I've come to realize that I've only seen part of the story," Judge Harper admitted, his voice quiet but sincere. "And I want to understand the bigger picture, the work you're doing and the lives it's changing. I've spent my career enforcing the law, but now I see how much more is needed." Sarah smiled slightly, but her eyes remained focused. "We all have something to learn, Judge, and sometimes it takes an unexpected moment to open our eyes to what's really important." As their conversation continued, Judge Harper began to understand that this wasn't just an apology. It was the beginning of something greater, something that could change not just his life, but his perspective on justice itself. As the conversation unfolded, Sarah and Judge Harper found themselves delving deeper into the heart of the issues that had shaped both of their lives. They spoke at length about the environment, about justice, and about the intersection of the two. The coffee shop, normally bustling with the low hum of casual chatter, seemed to fade into the background as they explored the complexities of Sarah's mission. What started as an apology had quickly turned into an exchange of ideas, an exploration of shared values, and a mutual realization of how their paths might intertwine. Judge Harper, having spent most of his career focused on interpreting the law, had never considered the broader context of the legal decisions he made. His work had always been about enforcing rules, about ensuring justice in its most traditional form. But Sarah's words were a revelation to him. She spoke not just about the importance of environmental conservation, but about how it tied into the struggle for social justice. She spoke of the need for equitable policies that addressed the disproportionate impacts of climate change on vulnerable communities, especially those that had already been marginalized by poverty, systemic racism, and historical neglect. As Sarah outlined the core principles of Green Horizons, Judge Harper realized how little he had understood about the interconnectedness of environmental issues and social justice. "You're talking about more than just trees and oceans," he said, his voice thoughtful. "You're talking about people." Sarah nodded. "Exactly. Without addressing the needs of the people who are most affected, without ensuring they have access to resources, education, and opportunities, environmental efforts will never be truly sustainable. It's about building resilience in communities, not just protecting the earth, but empowering those who need it the most." She continued to share stories of the communities Green Horizons had worked with, from the rural villages in Southeast Asia where people had built their own solar grids, to the cities in Latin America where the organization had fought for environmental justice through legal advocacy. It wasn't just about providing solutions. It was about creating systems of support that allowed communities to thrive on their own, without dependence on external aid. Judge Harper listened intently, his mind processing the new perspective Sarah had introduced. He began to see that true justice wasn't just about penalizing violations. It was about understanding the larger societal issues that gave rise to those violations in the first place. Environmental harm, he realized, wasn't a separate issue from inequality. It was a consequence of it. A community that faced systemic disadvantages was more likely to suffer from environmental damage and less likely to have the resources to combat it. I spent years making decisions based on rules, Judge Harper said quietly, almost to himself. But what I've come to understand is that those rules don't always account for the broader, deeper issues that people are facing. I've never thought about justice in the way you're describing it. It's a lot to absorb. Sarah smiled gently. It's a lot for anyone to absorb, but it's a journey we're all on. And the more we understand, the better equipped we are to make real change. The conversation stretched on for hours, and as they spoke, the connection between them grew stronger. It wasn't just a professional dialogue. It was a partnership beginning to take shape. Judge Harper realized that his role in the legal system, as an enforcer of justice, was something he could use to support the work Sarah was doing. He no longer saw her as an activist seeking to change the world from the outside. He saw her as someone whose vision aligned with his own sense of fairness, someone whose passion could help him reevaluate the very way he defined justice. "Maybe it's time I start looking beyond the courtroom," he said, his voice filled with new resolve. "Perhaps the law needs to evolve too." Sarah's eyes sparkled. "We can make it evolve, together." The days following their conversation were transformative for Judge Harper. He began to reconsider his approach to the law, questioning how he could integrate the lessons he had learned from Sarah into his daily work. His newfound perspective shifted his understanding of justice, moving beyond the legalistic framework to include a broader, more inclusive definition that embraced environmental and social equity. He knew that this shift would not be easy or quick, but it was the right path. The opportunity for change came sooner than he expected. A case was presented before him that seemed ordinary at first, a small business charged with polluting a nearby waterway. But as Judge Harper read through the details, he saw a pattern he had not recognized before. The company, which had been operating in a low-income community, had been fined several times for environmental violations, yet the community itself had been left with no resources to properly address the ongoing pollution. The residents, many of whom were already struggling with poverty, had little power to advocate for their rights or even clean up their surroundings. The more he dug into the case, the more he realized that the root of the problem wasn't just the business. It was the lack of legal and financial support for the people who were most affected. The case became a turning point for Judge Harper. He had the chance to make a decision that would go beyond a simple fine. He could choose to punish the business or create an opportunity for the community to reclaim their environment and gain the resources they needed to thrive. He reached out to Sarah for guidance, knowing that her expertise could provide a solution that wasn't just punitive but also restorative. Sarah's response was swift and clear. "This is exactly the kind of situation we work to address. We can't just penalize people or businesses. We need to ensure that there are systems in place to help communities protect themselves and hold corporations accountable." Together, they crafted a proposal for a restorative justice plan that would address the pollution while also providing the community with tools for long-term sustainability. The plan involved not only holding the business accountable, but also requiring it to fund a cleanup effort and establish a local environmental education program in the affected community. Furthermore, they proposed that part of the fine be used to establish a fund that would support local residents who wanted to pursue green business initiatives or environmental law careers. When Judge Harper presented the plan in court, there was an audible gasp from the audience. It was a groundbreaking approach, one that shifted the focus from punitive measures to proactive solutions. The business, while fined, was also given the opportunity to directly contribute to the recovery of the community it had harmed. The case was closed, but its impact rippled through the legal and environmental communities. Sarah watched from the back of the courtroom, a quiet smile spreading across her face. This was more than just a legal victory. It was proof that the system could change. Judge Harper had bridged the divide between law and compassion, between justice and sustainability, and together they had set the foundation for a new kind of environmental justice, one where the law didn't just punish, but helped rebuild. It was the beginning of something larger than they had ever imagined, a partnership that would shape the future of environmental justice, blending the power of the courtroom with the passion of grassroots activism. As months passed, Judge Harper and Sarah continued to collaborate, finding more and more ways to merge their work. They became an unlikely yet powerful duo, combining the weight of legal authority with the determination of a grassroots activist. Their partnership slowly gained recognition, especially within legal and environmental circles, where their innovative approach to justice was making waves. More and more cases came across Judge Harper's desk that mirrored the one they had tackled together, and he began using the same restorative methods Sarah had taught him. Rather than simply punishing violators, he sought to implement solutions that would repair the damage and empower communities to protect their futures. Sarah's influence also extended beyond the courtroom. Green Horizons had gained new allies and donors who believed in the intersection of environmental justice and social equity. Corporate partners who once turned a blind eye to the impact their businesses had on marginalized communities now sat down with Sarah to create sustainable, community-driven solutions. Governments, too, took note of their work, seeking advice on how to integrate environmental protection with policies that promoted equity. Sarah's phone rang more often with invitations to speak at global summits and conferences, but she never lost sight of the mission that had fueled her drive from the very beginning. One particularly significant moment came when Sarah was invited to present at an international environmental conference in Europe. She spoke passionately about the need to involve communities in the decision-making process when it came to environmental policies, using examples from Green Horizons projects. The room was filled with influential leaders from various sectors: politicians, business leaders, scientists, and environmental advocates. But when Sarah finished her presentation, it wasn't just her words that left an impression, it was her approach. People began to see that true environmental sustainability didn't begin with technology or legislation alone. It began with people, those who lived in the communities most impacted by climate change and environmental degradation. The idea of community-driven solutions gained traction, and by the end of the conference, Sarah had secured commitments for several collaborative projects that would bring real change to struggling communities around the world. Back home, Judge Harper's reputation grew as well. His rulings were no longer just seen as legal decisions. They were seen as models for how the law could be used to bring about social change. He was asked to speak at law schools and conferences, where he shared his journey from a strict enforcer of the law to a proponent of restorative justice. He also worked with environmental lawyers to draft new legal frameworks that incorporated the principles of equity and community involvement. Together, Sarah and Judge Harper had proven that when individuals from different worlds come together with a shared purpose, they can create lasting change. Their work was no longer just about two people or one case. It was a movement that was reshaping the way the world viewed environmental justice. Looking back at the path they had walked, Sarah and Judge Harper realized they had built more than just a partnership. They had created a legacy, one that would continue to influence generations to come. And as they stood side by side, watching the ripple effects of their work reach farther than they ever imagined, they knew that their journey was just beginning. The world was changing, and they were part of making it happen, one community, one decision, and one partnership at a time.